had the ambition to do necessarily, but certainly would have had that the doors would have naturally been open to me to do. Um, so I grew up in a family where we described ourselves as French Canadian, but I didn't really understand what that meant or know anything about what that meant or really think about it as a child. And partly that was because my family came in so many different waves that, like on my father's side, the family was already unilingual English speaking by my grandparents' generation. So, on that side, it was we were already quite removed. And then on my mother's side, that was also the case with my maternal grandfather. His French Canadian relatives had come in the early 1800s, and so by the early 1900s, I think they actually still were speaking French, but they were quite Americanized. And so the grandparent who I was most influenced by was my maternal grandmother, who was a first generation American. She was born in Vermont, but her parents were new arrivals from Quebec. And she grew up speaking French in Vermont. And she maintained extended family ties with people in Quebec. And so I grew up in the presence of French, even though I didn't speak it. And actually, my mother and her generation didn't speak it either. But I grew up knowing that I had some relationship to the French language. However, I also grew up knowing that my grandmother and her siblings were denied access to public education in Vermont as children because they didn't speak English. So they weren't allowed to go to school in the town where they grew up. And I don't know whether that was, I would love to know whether that was a consequence of sort of our local control that we like in Vermont education, or I don't know whether that was a violation of her civil rights at that time or not. But I know that when the family moved to another town, the kids were able to go to school. So I feel like that gets to a little bit of what Patrick was saying, that maybe sometimes laws aren't necessary in a place where it's just understood who's in charge in this town, you know. Um, so my grandmother really didn't receive a significant education because she didn't go to school until I think around fifth grade, and by then she wasn't really interested, and so she went to work in a woolen mill. And so I had that story in my family, and then I also had the story of my mother's generation, who, when they went to learn French in school, were told not to use any of what they knew from home, from living in a bilingual, multi-generational household, because that's not what we're studying here. Whatever that is, it's not, it doesn't belong in this class. And so when my opportunity came to learn French when I was in middle school, I just intuited that that wasn't a good idea, that it was going to be a humiliating or alienating experience. And I don't know whether that was accurate, but that was my sense, that that was not a place for me. And so I ended up learning Spanish. And I really love Spanish. I'm really glad I speak it. But I did miss out on the opportunity to ever speak French with my grandmother, to speak her language with her. I learned it. I learned how to speak French once she was already gone. Um, and I do feel like that was a loss. Um, I was also very fortunate to be able to go away to university and to get a almost free ride to do that. And when I did, I started wondering about who I was, because I was suddenly in a much more diverse environment. And by that, I mean that partly, yes, I was around a greater quantity of people of color than I had been growing up in Vermont, but I was actually also around a greater variety of white people than I had ever been around. And I noticed that I wasn't like them. And when I went looking for information at my university library about people like me, I didn't find anything. And now I know that was because, as Patrick has said, there's like just not a lot of research that's been done. Um, in fact, some historians have called the Canadian border, the U.S. Canadian border, a historiographical desert because it's just not something that people work on. Um, and I also know now that the term Franco-American didn't become a search term that you could use in a library until 2008. And this was probably around 1995. Um, So there was no way for me to find myself. So I came to kind of discover who I was as an adult. I took the long way around. Um, uh, and I'm grateful for what I have learned, but I wonder how it would have been different if I had had access to some of this information when I was younger. I can remember being taught in third grade of the immigration history of the United States. We did a very long and involved unit on Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty, and I loved it. I just thought it was so interesting, and I also knew that it had nothing to do with me. And I figured I must be the only one, right? And then at sometime in my 20s, I look at my high school yearbook and it's like at least half of the people have French names, and I don't have a French name. So you can't go by names. But that was not the story for a lot of the kids in that third grade play about about Ellis Island. And I don't remember ever being told anything about another way to get here, other than chattel slavery. Um, I don't think I was ever taught anything about Native Americans. I was told that they never lived here. So anyway, um, um, I've struggled. I have struggled in certain kinds of spaces with the kind of sense of not belonging or not feeling like I was supposed to be there. And I've been, um, yeah, it's taken a long time to sort of heal from that. But I think I've been actually really, really fortunate that I was surrounded by a family who, as Patrick said, different people cope with these things in different ways, and my family just was not going to be told what we could and couldn't do, I guess. That pretty much sums up my mother, I think. Thank you.
I love the ending of the resiliency piece that you just were referring to. Perhaps not the term she would use, but I do appreciate that. It leads us to the third question. Patrick, do you mind if we could move right into the third question for time's sake? I appreciate that. Thank you. Um, how have restorative practices or opportunities facilitated healing for you? And could you translate that into a recommendation for state government? So how Vermont could receive that information in a manner that could be a policy change or institutional change. And I want to just give a head nod to the third panelist because they inspired this question and the question before. Michelle, why don't you start
Nice.
for our third?
Okay.
Thanks.
Having participated in the St. Joseph's Orphanage Restorative Justice Inquiry, I feel that I had the opportunity to learn more about my past and was devastated to learn that members of my biological family were institutionalized by the state of Vermont mental health system. French Canadians faced extreme poverty and tried to follow the rules of the Catholic Church. Inability to care for their children due to poverty resulted in many kids being placed in St. Joseph's Orphanage. They brought their children to the orphanage with hopes that they would be close to the church and their French heritage, but the abuse at the orphanage made it clear that the church didn't meet the expectations of the families. The state wasn't checking on the children as needed, even though the state was paying the orphanage to care for them.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, third panelist. Thank you, Michelle. Abbey, would you like to comment on that last question?
Yeah, I think we could talk for a really long time about the ways in which the state and the church have been complicit. But I won't speak. I have some really concrete things I can say about the question addresses processes that could facilitate healing. And for me, the opportunities that have been most meaningful have been related to community and education. And I'm not actually sure that those are separate. I think they might be interwoven enough that they're not really different things. And I think there are many things that the state could do to create opportunities for healing and repair, and in a lot of ways, maybe experiences like the third panelist is describing of getting a chance to share your story and hear other people's stories and learning about the historical context for the things that happened to you and your family. So I first just wanted to mention two pieces of current education policy that I think are relevant to the experience I'm talking about. One is the IRIS Ethnic Studies Framework, which was created by Vermont educators, and it's intended for use in pre-K to 12 education. And my understanding is it can be used to develop a course or a sequence of courses, but the purpose of the framework is that it can be used in any part of the curriculum to help students, regardless of the subject matter they're studying, to help develop IRIS, so identity development, resisting racism, interconnectedness, and social responsibility. So the IRIS acronym is because the iris, I believe, is a native plant to Vermont, and it also is a plant with healing properties. And I know that for me, learning about my heritage has given me a real sense of solidarity with other people. And I think that that's sort of part of what this idea is with this framework, is how to creating a community in a school where students feel like they can develop their identities. The other piece of policy is the Act 1 education quality standards, which are intended to provide guidance for schools about how to bring this kind of broad historical perspective into classrooms, and to promote critical thinking around history and the contributions and viewpoints of different ethnic and social groups, and to give students a chance to explore questions about their ethnic identities, and to provide a space like in school to promote a school as a place where people can do that, where people can see themselves reflected and learn skills about talking about their own experiences and their families' experiences. So these are two policies that already exist. IRIS has not been approved by the state board, but I believe it should be. The Act 1 standards have been approved by the state board, but in both cases, the State Agency on Education really hasn't done anything to help teachers implement these tools in Vermont schools. And this really reminds me of what I heard in the educational panel having to do with the families of people with disabilities, where the state goes through the process of creating policies, and then the policy sits on a shelf somewhere and is never implemented. And then nobody knows why these problems don't get addressed. And it's because it's actually up to the state. The state has a pattern of behavior of not following through on its own policy. So there are these like beautiful policies that I really think would address a lot of what we're talking about. And I would love to see the state give educators the tools to really implement these frameworks in a robust way in Vermont schools. And in fact, I think if they did that, it would be a really concrete indication of a real serious intention toward reconciliation and repair with the Act 128 groups. I also think it's really important that educational tax dollars not be given to Catholic institutions until more significant repair is done on the part of the church. I think that public post-secondary institutions in Vermont can do more to support first-generation Vermont college students, particularly UVM with its very complicated history of eugenics. And as someone who went to university on an almost free ride, I can say that like being able to get into the institution and go to the classes is part of it, but being able to provide people with the kind of mentorship supports that they need to feel like they belong there is really important, so that people who don't have access within their family network to understand how academia works, or how you complete degrees, or where you're going professionally. Those kinds of supports should absolutely be in place for first generation college students in Vermont. I would also love to see an investment in the kind of research that Patrick Lacroix is doing and other historians who, because it is so difficult as Vermont is one of the states that has a really, really high proportion of people with French Canadian heritage. And it's really, really difficult to find information about who our people were because they weren't important people. So I would love to see I don't expect to see investment in that kind of research, but I would really love to see like the Canadian Studies Department, for example, that's been dismantled at UVM, um, get some more resources. I also think just investment in the teaching of world languages in public schools is really important, not just the French language, but just to give people access to languages that they need as global citizens, but also sometimes need as citizens of their families. So those are the major concrete steps I would take. The other thing I just want to say is that I think that what's really important about the Franco-American story is the way that it intersects with other stories. And so we're part of the labor history of the United States. We're part of the immigrant history of the United States. If you're talking about migrant agricultural labor, that's us. If you're talking about the reproductive history or, the history of Catholics in the US, we just intersect with a lot of these other stories. And so it's really easy to include us in, in your curriculum, whatever you're teaching. And also I wanted to say that my understanding of my own ethnic history has really enriched my identity as a white person and has like really given me deep connection to other people, like not just to Franco-American people, but to the experiences of other human beings. And that's really what's really precious about it, is that when we know who we are, we know how to connect better with other people. Excuse me.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Abbey. I'm not going to comment. I'm just going to sit with that. Thank you for that. We have 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure that our audience members get to participate and be in dialogue with all of you. So this is a time, community members, partners, guests, please engage with our panelists. Please start a dialogue or ask a question. And we're here for that. If you want to put your question also in the chat, happy to review that and ask it for you. We do have a comment. There's a comment about the University of Maine has a great Canadian American Center. I participated last summer in a training institute for instructors of French in Quebec City, but they have many other great resources and programs.
Yeah, that's me. Hi, I'm Michelle Gehring. I'm sorry, my video is not working tonight.
Okay.
I teach French at Susquehanna University in Pennsylvania, but I thought I would just add that, it's a possible resource that could be helpful to someone. I was really impressed by their programs. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Sure,
Appreciate
thank
it.
you.
And welcome.
I would also say, Faith, there's one more comment before the one about the University of Maine from Suzanne Blanchard.
Gotcha. Got it. Thank you. Thank you.
And Patrick, I would love to hear the answer to the third question from Patrick too, on recommendations specifically.
Okay. Okay. Well, if it's okay with you, Mia, let's do Suzanne's, and then I did see Patrick, you had a hand as well. So we'll see how we're going to fit it all in. We're going to make it happen. Suzanne, sorry for accidentally overlooking that. Suzanne says we live not just on the ancestral and unceded lands of Abenaki people, but known as the Anoba in their own language, but on land that is in Nouvelle, France, from 1609 to shortly before the War of Independence. All of the Champlain Valley was New France. In my family and many other around here, we had ancestors in the Lake Champlain Basin 3 centuries ago, and we're still here. But like the indigenous people of this land, we were quite intentionally erased in many specific ways. That has deep consequence in my family and every generation right down to now. Suzette, thank you.
So I would just like to add to that, Patrick, we know each other from the work that Patrick, I have so much stuff to tell you. We had a person down from Quebec this weekend who has been doing a town study on Virgens and has just uncovered a tremendous amount of stuff. But what I've been doing recently is mapping all of the families and French Canadian ancestry from back during when we were New France through, because as what people do is we're kind of erased until you get to, as Patrick has written about many times, until you get to the Industrial Revolution and people coming down to the mills. But in fact, here, or right around here in northwestern Vermont, most of those people are very well connected to families that were here during the Revolution and who were here before that. As in my family, it is quite often that it was somebody who was in the French de Marines or in Carignan fighting for France. Then they fought in the Revolution, then they fought in the War of 1812, and blah, blah, blah. They became Americans, but they were French way back then, and they kept their history. And in my family, that lasted until my grandfather was orphaned, and I literally didn't know about it until like 10 years ago. So, and that has a lot to do with how the history is written. So I know many other people do here as well, but I just have, record after record, book after book of examples of how we were written out. And specific people, Henry Parkman is a guy who is one of the people who characterized us, as Petra was talking about the Wright report, in a way that dismissed us and dismissed our history here, and resulted in that racism against us. And it also has a lot to do with the fact that we were here with the indigenous people, and from the English perspective, we were kind of thrown in together, and that it was all of our erasure. One more thing I would just say is that that's true for many, many groups in Vermont. For example, we had the very first Black pastor ordained in America, and nobody knows that. And his book is barely in any libraries, and he was an amazing man who served in Rutland for 30 years.
Suzette, thank you so much. I'm just paying attention to time, so I want to make sure Patrick gets to respond to the third question as Mia had asked, and also Suzette's maybe prompting you. So I want to make sure that you have that space.
Thank you. I mean, that's first of all, yes. As Suzanne knows, I'm sold on this, and we're doing our best to spread the word. And I'll also put in a really good word for the Vermont French Canadian Genealogical Society, that is just a treasure trove of information. And one of the points I wanted to touch upon just a little bit earlier had to do with infrastructure, especially as the University of Maine came up. Cultural infrastructure. In Maine, we have 3 research centers, 3 collections that are specifically dedicated to the French Canadian and Acadian experience. We have one in Lewiston, we have one in Orono, we have one in Fort Kent. And those are hosted by the University System of Maine. That is a lot of infrastructure. That is public support, that is tangible, that makes a clear difference in the lives of people who see themselves represented, for one thing. And these are not static collections. All of us hold events constantly throughout the year. So it's a way for the larger community to engage. There are other similar groups, not as well supported perhaps, but still public infrastructure in other states, or at least nonprofits that are able to access public funds. That has never happened on a large scale in Vermont. And that's something that Abbey touched upon that needs to change. The University of Vermont would be the perfect conduit for that, to host a collection, to have a speaker series, to fund a way of providing more visibility. And that's something that's been very common. And just to circle very quickly back to the comment from our anonymous co-panelist, that person referred to orphanages. There are hospitals, a whole string of Catholic infrastructure that was built up starting in the second half, for the most part, of the 19th century. With the loss of that Catholic infrastructure, we've lost a lot of the French Canadian infrastructure, cultural infrastructure as well. And there's good and bad in everything. I'm not putting that out there as a value judgment. Simply a fact that we've lost a lot of the societies and the grassroots efforts and some of the institutions that were in many respects the glue of French Canadian culture, especially in a state like Vermont that didn't have public support. So that's been lost, and now there are very few organizations that are dedicated specifically to the French Canadian story. And there are great organizations that do really great programming. The Alliance Française is one. They're doing terrific work, oftentimes with limited means. And it's great that they have this holistic approach to the Francophone world. That's slightly different from what we're talking about with regard to Franco-Americans. So there are ways of enhancing that visibility. And the good thing nowadays is we have something that Abbey did not have in 1995, which is the web and Google. And there are a lot of really active, interesting, motivated young Franco-Americans who are seizing the means of asserting themselves, of putting themselves out there. There are great initiatives that I could go on and on about. I won't, to spare you and to respect our time limits. But luckily, there is that public visibility. And I mentioned that partly because it has a clear effect, but having that visibility in those online spaces doesn't mean that government is off the hook, that we can do without legislation, that we can do without the public support that has been so crucial to the maintenance of the Franco-American identity in Maine, in New Hampshire, and in so many other places. So I would simply echo Abby's remarks, and that's my way of addressing, perhaps a little indirectly, the comment about the University of Maine.
Thank you, Patrick. Abby, I wasn't sure if you wanted to say something. No, okay.
Well, I would just say, I just wanted to say that I know that Commissioner Schultz could speak much more eloquently than I about the Act One policy and education policy in general. And so she's a great person to direct questions to about that because I'm not. But anyway.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you. Okay, so there was another question. I know we're about a minute away, so if people can hold on, maybe a minute after, it'd be great. Can you please speak to the reality of French Canadians in Vermont, New England today, and how deeply held beliefs of bias affect life in Vermont today for French Canadian Franco-Americans? And there's a second part to that. Also, something is in my way, so I can't read the rest of that. Also something, there can be a significant intermarriage between French Canadians and the Indigenous community, as well as the use of eugenics in both communities. So I realize that's a big question. If there's any parts of that you might want to take on, or just respond in a way that feels right to you, either Patrick or Abbey.
I will gladly defer to Abbey, at least for the first part of that. Not to put you on the spot if you're not comfortable, Abbey, but I'm happy to yield my time.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure that I understand the question, that the deeply held beliefs of bias affect life. So I take that to mean that people's sense of bias, maybe, or perhaps whether people still experience discrimination. I would say that, I mean, actually, I've been given several examples of people having recent experiences of I guess maybe things that would be considered microaggressions, but something like somebody moving to a new community and deciding that they were going to join a social club in that community and being told that they're in the wrong place because of their last name. They should go and join this other thing because we don't do that with you here. I've also heard stories about people. So I think still things do still pop up, and I think it's probably in less high stakes ways than it would have been. You know, Patrick mentioned things that people would have had to deal with in their daily life before. I think it's probably now less frequent things and things that are less existentially threatening than they might have once been. But I would say that like the way in which No, I guess I won't say that. Anything Patrick would like to add would be useful, I'm sure.
Thank you, Abby, for responding to that. Yeah. I have to pay attention to time. I could go on. I could ask more questions myself, but I won't. I won't.
Maybe
I
we
want
can, I'd love to hear about the second question, although I'm not quite sure about the second question. If anybody wants to take 3 minutes to have Patrick try to dig into that. How do you feel? The second part of that question? Patrick?
Oh, I wasn't sure if you were asking about
No, I was just
time for
asking
that
you, like,
question, but okay.
yeah.
That's that could be a few dissertations right there.
Right.
And we have, a really good book in the form of Mercedes de Guardiola's recent work
Nice.
that tackles. So
Yep.
I'd refer people who want to learn more. Maybe that can be a starting point, since I think she tackles the issue very deftly and by looking um, at primary sources, and some that have, until she came along, had never really been looked at by researchers. Um, and and I would equivocate also in my answer, partly because um, the the primary sources aren't always as transparent as we'd like about race and ethnicity. And it's hard to tell what is authors couching their language in acceptable terms or using bywords to talk about French Canadians or people they deem to be um, less than, on whom they could experiment and practice all sorts of medical procedures without people's consent. And so what that book does is it addresses very important issues that unquestionably affected Franco-Americans who were living at that time, who were institutionalized, sometimes with their consent, but not knowing what would come after, sometimes and often without their consent. Were French Canadians targeted more than other groups? That's a question that needs to be parsed out. Um, in some respects, it seems as though the leaders of this eugenics movement were equal opportunity offenders, partly because they experimented and they had a very clear view of, an imagined hierarchy, if you will, social hierarchy. And that needs to be parsed out as well. And I'm, again, being slightly ambiguous because I've read very different things from different authors on this topic as to whether French Canadians were targeted, and singled out. Um, but there is a case to be made that when they were, it was because there was the perception that they had intermarried significantly with people of indigenous descent. So that absolutely affected the perspective and the approach that people like Perkins and Davenport and others, who are at the head of the movement, how they approached eugenics. So I don't think that we can really separate the two. I think we have to talk about indigenous groups. We have to talk about French Canadians, and they're, in some respects, they have a shared history. We also have to talk about the history involved in French Canadians coping and making their peace by separating themselves from indigenous groups because of the stigma that affected them and that carried into the eugenics movement. So that's as brief as I can be, alas, on the topic.
Thank you, Patrick. All right, I'm gonna just hand this over to the commissioners to wrap us up. And I want to say thank you to our third panelists, Abby and Patrick, for being here, and also to thank the community for being here. Commissioners Schultz and Mackin, would you like to wrap us up?
I think that was a perfect way to end. I appreciate you. Oh, I'm on spotlight. I appreciate you all for here enlightening us all and also binding the thread that has happened among all the groups that we have. The thread goes through all of the groups that we are charged to examine and in this Act 128. And so I always appreciate this perspective and the way that everything connects. So thank you again for being here, and to our panelists who could not be in front of all of us and still used their voice to be participating in this. And I want that to be a model for when we get to truth telling. So I appreciate them for being courageous to find a way to participate. Thank you. And I don't know if Melody is able to.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
that's okay. Okay.
yeah.
Thank you, Commissioner Schultz. With that, everyone, good night, good day. Stay in touch with us. And thank you for being here.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too, Michelle.
Thank you.